Hello, today we're here with poet Bruce Bond, who's going to read his poem for Sign and Breath and discuss it with us today. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Shall I start? Okay.
Yes.
This is an elegy of sorts for Geoffrey Hill, and it's entitled Peacock. It's based on several poems by Geoffrey Hill, but one primarily entitled Peacock. Geoffrey Hill is dead, and still, now, as I read his words, his voice keeps crossing over. And a woman at a nearby table says to her companion, I am so many people these days. Mother, child, whore, I feel exhausted. And as she laughs, her unlit cigarette keeps making little circles, and the other woman listens. I want to say, I know the feeling, when I know I cannot. I want to break through unspoken boundaries. I cannot write of nobody, says Hill. No one to narrate this. But then his writing, with all its ferocity and plumage, turns from an image of the self as a peacock to praise the bird's bare, corrosive scream. I cannot speak for no one. I try. Some laughter belies the cutlery inside it. But what I see in the author's portrait is his namesake, a rock, withholding and thereby held. What I hear is a woman and her broken English, the many selves lonely for the one who talks of them. Her companion says yes. The unlit cigarette rises and falls. And as I bow my head, I read a little deeper. Names live alone their separate lives, says Hill. Yes, I say, and softer still, yes, yes. So I picked this poem for this particular anthology because it's obviously so much about voice, but it's about what voice can accomplish and what it cannot. And that's a subject very, very dear to me. I think voice is hugely important in a poem, in creating a sense of personhood. But that sense is always failed. That's not to say that all failure is the same. These failures are relative, and the relative nature of failure is absolutely essential to understanding what a poem is and how it works. This is you could see that the woman in the poem is struggling with the idea of representing herself accurately. She's so many different selves. And that dissonance or that distance between representation and the actual authentic self, which is hidden, which is withheld, is very, very important to understanding just the distance between any kind of identity construct and this unrepresentable aspect of the self that is more interior. I sometimes bemoan the fact that we have conflated the issue of identity with the issue of selfhood so much that now if we can see flaws in identity constructions, we think then there's no more real out there to access. And that's, I think, ultimately tragic in this age when there's so much emphasis on self-performance that's facilitated by social media and so forth. It just exacerbates the problem where people are busy curating their constructed selves. And there's less talk about how that construction can be either a kind of faithful or I would say a representation done in bad faith. I don't think there's such a thing as a credible poem without this horizon that we call authenticity out there somewhere. But to conflate it with the idea that, a poem is a crystallization of the authentic is unfortunate. And I think it just opens the door for all kinds of, the new conceptualism and Marjorie Perloff kind of dismissing the idea of authenticity in poetry because there's so much fabrication online. Yes, exactly. That's why it's important, because we are bombarded with insincere representations. So if there's such a thing as a phony, there's such a thing as a real out there. But that's not to say it can be constructed. So I think that's hugely important. I think it's important to understanding even the politics of our time. So that's one reason I picked this. Jeffrey Hill's an interesting example because here he is writing a poem about a peacock praising the bare corrosive thing, that is more interior. And yet his verbal constructions can sometimes be formidable. They are, I wouldn't say they are decorated, but I would say they tend toward the highly rhetorical. And the fact that that rhetoric pays off is a tribute to his genius. I would say he's in the category of someone like a Hart Crane, maybe a Hopkins, in that they've created voices that are quite clearly, to my ear, artificial. And yet there still is this sense of necessity about them, that they aren't just full of ornaments. So I picked him as an example, in part because there is this framing paradox in that particular poem and some other poems where he seems to be critiquing the very thing that he is so clearly associated with, which is a kind of high rhetoric. But then I found it was not in the Peacock poem, it was in a different poem, this quote, names live alone their separate lives, which is kind of admitting that poems have a reality that is not our personal possession. I mean, you're entering into a public forum. Language is very much that place where the public and private meet and often conflict. And this is no more evident than in the world of poetry. We associate it with interiority, that's its strength. Iris Murdoch has this fantastic passage about metaphor, which is really the heart of the poetic. She knows a lot about literature, that metaphor is our best means out there for representing inner life, which is hugely important in this day and age. Interiority is unfairly under attack, as a kind of bourgeois luxury or something, a way of kind of withdrawing from the world. But I don't see it that way. First of all, our interiors are deeply invested in the world. There is no interior without a world to engage. And to me, it is our way of humanizing that world, of expressing why it matters and our relation to it. So those things are going on. But then also, you've put together this wonderful anthology on this issue of voice, which is so closely wedded to music in my mind. I mean, obviously it's oral, but there's a relationship between musical phrasing and the way that we use language, the way that syntax works, and so forth. I'm an instrumentalist, but I recognize when I phrase, when I improvise, and I think all instrumentalists are the same, you recognize some kind of relationship between musicality and singing, or the voice, the way the voice works, the way it breathes, and therefore phrases. So when I think of voice, I think of this evanescent quality in a poem, the part that evaporates, the musical quality, the performative quality that is there and gone. And that's always in dialogue in my mind with the trace that's left behind. So there's a sense of a poem always as both a process and a thing. And I would never want to exclude one of those things from the equation, which is why I'm drawn to poetry that has an auditory dimension. To me, because it's so associated with a voice, it's associated with a human presence, but also it's associated with the brevity of that presence. And I find that deeply, deeply moving. You know, there's a quote from Robert Bly where he says, from the ear to the heart, from the eye to the mind. Okay, so it's very quotable. It's very short. It's not always true, but there is some truth to that. The experience of weeping, just hearing a piece of music, is pretty common. The experience of weeping before a painting is pretty uncommon. So that says something. And I think it might have to do with, well, it probably has to do with a number of mysterious things that I can't even talk about, that I don't even know about. But I think it has something to do with the fact that music is so much about time. And so it embodies so much of our just kind of existential anxiety. It's very much about becoming, not just being, right? Its evanescence is part of its power. You know, it's making friends with time, which is the source of so much fear in us. And now we see it turned into something beautiful. I think there's something very, very compelling about that equation, the redemptive power of music to take this element of time and make it beautiful. So that's why I picked this.
Bruce Bond, musician, poet, accomplished in both areas to an enormous degree, and such a pleasure to hear you talk about poetry and about the process and being. And thank you so much for being with us at Sign and Breath.
Okay, thanks.